started. We were kind of waiting for our Planning Commission members to come and join us, so we appreciate that you've come and joined us. I'm Jamie Damon. I'm the Sage-Grouse Project Manager for the state of Oregon, working out of Oregon State University, Institute for Natural Resources, on behalf of the governor. So what we have tonight, we're planning to be here until 9, and we can stay as long as you all would like us to stay. We might not need to stay that long. We have a presentation. Are we using this?
Yeah, that's probably safe.
Should dim the lights?
Oh, yeah, I think dim and the lights would be good.
I
So
can.
this is how we've organized our time together. I introduce myself. Chip, Brett, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Brett Brownscombe, Acting Deputy Director with Department of Fish and Wildlife. I came over from Salem today and carpooled down to Chip, and it's good to see some rain. Surprise, but good. So thanks for Commissioner Kessler, thank you for hosting.
And I'm Chip Dale. I'm the watershed manager for ODFW, manage both the Klamath and Mount Here watersheds, district watersheds. And we're here tonight basically recognizing a long travel distance, so gathering information will be shared with the commission. So input from y'all.
Since we have such a small group, if we could just go around and just sense of who's in the room, that would be really great.
Jim Kessler, Lake County Commission. I've been working on the Sage-Grouse group for some time.
Keith Barnhart, I'm with the SWCD, with the CCAA, and also on a ranch that's right in the middle of the core area.
So lots of interest there.
Justin Farrell, pretty much the same as what he said.
Welcome. And Planning Commission member.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Mike King, I'm a planning commission member, Lake County.
I'm Mary Jo Hedrick, the Assistant Wildlife ED in Lake County, I'm stationed in Summer Lake.
Shannon Sheffield, also the Planning Commission, also in property on the north end of Summer Lake.
James Baird, and I'm just here to listen.
Welcome.
Jimmy Hall from the Lake County Examiner newspaper.
Jimmy.
I'm Craig Foster, I'm the district wildlife biologist for Lake County here in Lakeview.
Okay, well, so we've got a brief presentation. I want to give you some background about why we're proposing these rules and how they fit in the whole scheme of things, the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years. And then Chip is going to talk about, kind of do a little deeper dive into some highlights of the rules themselves. We actually have copies up here for you folks if you want to follow along. And then if you can hold your questions till the end, we'll be happy to answer all the questions as best we can based on the folks we have here. And then this is a public hearing, and so we are prepared to take formal testimony at the very end. We can record it, you can submit it in writing, so there's a number of ways that we can do that if that's something that you want to do tonight. So with that, so let me just give you a little bit of background. We came down, Chip and I came down a couple weeks ago and met with your county commissioners and a couple of your planning commission members, and so some of this will be a little familiar to a few of you folks. But some of the feedback that we got back was it'd be really helpful to give the broader context as opposed to just talk about what we're proposing with these amendments to the rules. So here's just a little time frame here about what's going on. So in 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service designated sage-grouse as warranted but precluded species due to wildfire threats, invasive weeds and juniper, and habitat fragmentation. And this is across 11 western states. It's one of the biggest endangered species potential listing in the nation. And in Oregon, the biggest threats that we have are wildfire and invasive weeds and juniper. Those are our biggest threats. Some of the other states are much bigger threats on the side of development pressure. And that hasn't been the case in Oregon because of our land use planning system. And so, but we do have some issues related to habitat fragmentation, and there is a companion rule. The Land Conservation and Development Commission will be hearing a proposed companion rule to the ODFW rule this Thursday in Burns. And so they'll go together, and we can talk a little bit about those in a little bit as well. So in 2011, ODFW developed a sage-grouse conservation strategy, really focused on core areas. You heard core areas mentioned today. You guys are familiar with that. But the core areas focus on 90% of the breeding populations. And the conservation strategy is quite simple. It's to avoid impacts in core areas. That's, in a nutshell, what that's all about. From really earlier than 2012, but over the last 3 or 4 years, Oregon has been trying to put together, and we're very close to completing it, an action plan. It started out to be an all lands, all threats plan, and now we're calling it the Sage-Grouse Action Plan. And what that is, it's a compilation of all the work that not just state agencies are doing, but that private landowners are doing, conservation groups are doing, soil water conservation districts are doing, all the work that we're doing to address the threats that we have in Oregon, which again are primarily wildfire and invasive species. And so our action plan is this sort of comprehensive look at everything that Oregon is doing, what the threats are, the status of the threats, the work that we're doing, how we plan to implement it. And we will be submitting that to the Fish and Wildlife Service in August, in mid-August. So we're really close to finishing that. You'll see this where it says Sage-Con, developed through Sage-Con. There's this group that was put together, when was that put together, Brett? Because it was prior to me, 4 years ago, 5 years
Yeah,
ago?
that was actually in 2010, when it was just related to
Yeah, so 5
energy,
years ago.
then it morphed into a larger discussion related to rangeland health and sage-grouse.
Yeah, so in 2010, there was a lot of pressure coming into Oregon around development of wind facilities primarily, and the state didn't have a good way to respond to that in a comprehensive manner. And so Sage-Con was put together as a collaborative effort to figure out how we can work across state and federal agencies and private land ownerships to, how we address this issue of a lot of development pressure coming in around wind. And that development pressure has backed away a little bit, but so it's morphed into a more comprehensive look about what are we all doing to ensure that we're guiding development away from sensitive habitat and how we're addressing our threats. So Sage-Con is this collaborative group that has state and federal agencies, local government, private landowners, hunting interests, ag interests, ranching interests, conservation groups. It's more than 60 folks that get together 3 or 4 times a year in all-day meetings and have been trying to knit together not just our actions, but also the data and the science, and making sure that we're all pulling from the same methodology, so we're all working towards the same end. So that's what Sage-Con is, and so the action plan is really a product of that combined work. So in September 2015, the Fish and Wildlife Service must make their determination about whether or not sage-grouse should be listed as an endangered species. In conversations with Fish and Wildlife Service, they will be making that probably at the end of September, so we'll all find out sometime in October or early fall. Again, it affects 11 western states. So as I talked about, the statewide action plan is kind of a roll-up of everything that we're doing, including work with the soil water conservation districts, CCAAs, and interest groups. I talked about the purpose of the plan. So the purpose of the plan, I mentioned this earlier, this is Oregon's case. In some ways you could think about it that we're in a negotiation with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Each state is trying to make a case to the service about, that we got this covered. We don't need it listed here. Here's our conservation measures and actions and how we're going to implement that. Here's our funding that we're putting in place. Here's how we're providing certainty that we're not going to continue to impact the habitat for the bird over time. Each state is making that individual case, and our action plan is Oregon's case. So there's a couple of outcomes from this case. One could be that the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't make the determination that sage-grouse should be listed as an endangered species. So that's one. And if they make that case, if they say that, it will most likely be because of the work that the states are doing. So we will continue to implement our action plan. Another option is that they list it as endangered in other states, but we are able to negotiate an exception here. It's called a 4D exception. This is something that Commissioner Kessler wanted me to bring up. A 4D exception is basically a special exception that says, these other states haven't made a strong enough case to us that we are convinced that these other states are going to either, they're going to stem this decline. But we see that Oregon is doing a great job, and so we're going to give you an exception. So that's basically what a 4D exception is. So that's what we're angling for. Just go ahead.
Up to that, the Fish and Wildlife Service won't separate Oregon out of the listing. The 4D would say, Oregon, you have your strategies and plan. We let you manage underneath your plans instead of the Fish and Wildlife Service and DC manage.
Yep, that's a good clarification. So it retains the most local control, state control, which is what we want, because we want to be able to work in that adaptive management context the best way we can. So this talks about a number of the other things that the state plan does, because since the warranted but precluded decision in 2010, we've been doing a lot as a state, and so this action plan also updates everything that we've been doing since then. If you look down about 5 bullets, it says provides regulatory certainty around development, presents a framework for planning, implementation, and monitoring adaptive management. That's where these rules fit in. That's the rules part of the action plan. We've had a number of questions about, does this plan replace the 2011 strategy? And Chip is better able to address this than I am, but the short answer is no. It basically serves as a way to implement aspects of the strategy. The overall strategy is set to be updated in 2016, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, so once we have the action plan in place, then the overall strategy and the action plan can work together. So one of the key questions that the Fish and Wildlife Service wants to know is, how do we ensure that this plan is going to be implemented? They don't want to see a state plan that's a wish list. That's a lot of, well, then we're going to do this and then we're going to do that. But there isn't the certainty that things are going to happen. So one of the ways that Oregon is providing certainty to the Fish and Wildlife Service is by putting in place not just the action plan that shows how we're going to actually implement this, but also it has committed funding through the legislature, and Brett Brownstone can talk about that a little bit at the end of our presentation. So we need to commit funding. All the states are doing that to address our threats. And we're working on a memorandum of understanding, that's what an MOU is, to show that we're coordinating at the highest level, but also at the street level, at the field level, with our state and federal partners. There's the other pieces of certainty that the Fish and Wildlife Service is looking for is regulatory certainty. So one piece of that is on the land use side, so that they can see that we are continuing to steer development away from core habitat and or have a way to mitigate for those impacts, and that's the LCDC rule that will be heard in Burns on Thursday. And then if you have to mitigate for those impacts, how do we do that? And that's the ODFW mitigation rules. And that's what Chip's going to talk about now.
Thanks, Jamie.
Do you want to run that yourself?
Sure. So a couple things that have happened through time, and those of you that are familiar with Sage-Grouse management. Some of the things that came up is the way we ended up with regard to the Sage-Grouse plan. It made it very difficult for us to address development actions. So one of the things that happened in the past legislative session, not this recent one, but the one before, is there were statutes passed, basically sponsored by Cliff Benz, that directed or asked us to move forward, develop rules for mitigation when developments are occurring in core habitat. Our current existing mitigation rules tell us and our staff that we recommend avoiding any impacts and avoiding any developments that would impact sage-grouse core habitat. So what we're dealing with is twofold. One is, Jamie said, trying to come up with something that addresses some of the Fish and Wildlife Service's issues with regard to certainty. But the other thing it does is it basically recognizes there's going to be development in core, but it starts setting the stage on how do we mitigate that development in core, and basically the other aspect of it is put some sideboards on how much development would have happened in core at the time. And it does that. The other thing is, for those of you that deal in land use planning, basically at this point in time, when we make a recommendation to a county or another entity, our recommendations are just that, recommendations. They don't carry any weight or any obligation that they need to be followed, and we recognize that. Well, in order to meet the certainty issue that's been brought up by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and in conjunction with LCDC's rules, these mitigation rules would actually be required to be implemented on developments, and we're really focusing on large developments like wind farms and things like that. Then that would basically deliver us what we need to convey to the Fish and Wildlife Service, that no, we're able to manage this and we're able to manage these developments and work for a better condition for sage-grouse through time. The other piece of that is these rules fit into the action plan, and really the goal of the action plan is a general uplift in the population of sage-grouse in Oregon. I mean, it's in our best interest, and basically very much so. I think those of you that are ranchers, a lot of what's in that action plan is good for cattle, it's good for sage-grouse. So that general uplift is one of the key components of these. In order to get there, we established a Rules Advisory Committee. Commissioner Kestner was gracious enough to participate and did an excellent job. We really appreciate it, but really gave us a pretty good perspective from the county standpoint. But the counties that were actively involved were Harney, Crook, Baker, Lake, Union County, which doesn't have a big sage-grouse population, and to a lesser extent, Malheur was there on occasion from the planner standpoint, and then also Deschutes on occasion was there. But we had good participation from the counties, and it was a very welcome participation. Oregon Farm Bureau was represented at the table. We had the Nature Conservancy as one of the conservation groups. Northwest Renewables was representing primarily the energy development, because as I said before, and Jamie said, the typical energy development in the desert portions of Oregon now are looking at renewables and particularly wind farms and solar. We had Portland Audubon. Those folks have been actively involved with sage-grouse for quite some time. The Oregon Cattlemen's Association, one of your neighbors, John O'Keefe, participated with us, provided us very good input. And then we had commissioners from both the Fish and Wildlife Commission and from LCDC that participated and helped give us guidance. Other folks that sat in and participated in the meetings but really weren't members of the advisory committee for various reasons included other state agencies that provided input, ODOT, Land Conservation Development Commission. We did have Department of Energy there pretty regularly, Department of Geology, Minerals and Industry, State Lands, Department of Agriculture. Also, you know, we're developing this and working on this with regard to a target of addressing some of the issues that are brought forward by the Fish and Wildlife Service. We had them there as sounding boards. So we had staff, not necessarily the final decision maker, but people that could be advising them. And then two tribes that were actively interested in sage-grouse, the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs and the Birds Pipes. So all in all, it was I would be kidding if I didn't say it wasn't interesting, but it was truly a productive enterprise. So the existing rules that we manage under now. So as Jamie alluded to, we have the sage-grouse strategy for the state of Oregon. It's the assessment and strategy. I refer to it as the plan. It's a 190-page document. It contains quite a bit of data in it, contains a lot about how we would develop things like core areas. But what we ended up doing in 2011 was taking the key component parts of that plan and putting them in administrative rule. Administrative rule is much shorter, much cleaner, much easier to deal with. So the existing rules focus on three aspects of dealing with sage-grouse. First one being population management. So we basically established that we would manage over the next 50 years for a population averaging around 30,000 birds. Habitat management, we basically set a goal that we would be trying to manage for 70% of sage-grouse habitat in those older age stands of sage-grouse. And then what we came forward with was how to address, and with the potential coming a listing, potential coming all the development, a conservation approach. And that's where we came up with the core area approach, where we identified the smallest amount of habitat to protect the greatest number of birds. The new rules that we're bringing forward, and we're talking to tonight, are going to be addressing how to go about mitigating impacts in sage-grouse habitat. We didn't talk about mitigation in the existing rules or in the plan itself. And mitigation is basically a whole series of actions that we would take. When I say we, I'm talking about the universal, all of us, starting with trying to avoid first, then if not, we minimize, and then finally the last step would be what would we do to compensate, compensatory mitigation. Very briefly, people have asked about the 30,000 birds and where we got it, what made sense. This is a period of record since 1980 with regard to what the population estimate has been. You can see 30,000 birds is not like picking the highest peak through time, but it was a number that we thought represented something sustainable for the habitat that's available that we can manage for in the next 50 years or so. With regard to the habitat goal, we set a goal that we being Oregon, be managing sage-grouse habitat, which is basically sagebrush country, in older structural stand classes. So we're looking at 3, 4s, and 5s. I mean, these are the bigger, older sagebrush stands. And that 70% of that sage-grouse habitat be in that condition. The other 30% would be either disturbed sites or would be non-habitat types included in there. That basically at 70% approximate basically pretty close to what's out there. So again, it's not something where we shot for a pie in the sky that was way beyond what we could achieve. It also is scientifically based on the literature looking at sage-grouse across their range. That's a pretty good measure of where we've seen productive populations. And finally, the core area approach. What this is that we had gone through and taken a look at all our LEC sites that we knew of, and in the inventory of those LEC sites, and we identified where were those areas that we could protect 90% of the population with the least amount of land mass. And I think in terms of, you're looking at sage-grouse habitat across the state, that's about 38% or 30% of the 30% of the land area that's within sage-grouse habitat protects 90%, and those are those areas circled in red. Those are the core areas. So y'all are probably familiar, as I've heard many of you have ranches and whatnot in core areas. I got to tell you, the Warner country is pretty productive sage-grouse habitat, and that's actually a compliment to all of you that they've been sustained so well and are doing well. Just for information, because we talked a little bit about it, those areas that are showing up in blue, those are low-density habitats. Those are areas of low densities of birds that are still very important, and they interact with the core area. Some places they provide travel corridors, exchanges between those populations in the core areas, and also may provide some alternative season habitats. The area in yellow is still generally sage-grouse habitat, but it was area that wasn't basically supporting so many birds that we mapped it as either the low density or the core. So what's new in the rules that we're bringing forward? Well, first off is we had those existing rules that addressed population, habitat, and the core area approach. Some of the things we needed to do when we entered into this process was modify some of that slightly. We didn't really want to open up the whole can of worms, knowing we're going back to the plan in 2016, but some edits to clean up some language. We added some sub-goals in the habitat section to clarify. And then we came up with the mitigation policies. The mitigation policies will be the whole new section that we will have. And then finally, in the end, we actually clarify the relationship between these mitigation rules, and the department has another set of mitigation rules that talks about mitigation in general. But these are specific only to sage-grouse. So the definition that we talked about, we just more clearly define habitat types for protection. The core areas, we described how we went about developing those, what they're based on. Low density areas, the difference between the core and those low density areas, and what the general habitat is. So I showed you those on the map. And then we had to come up with a term when we started talking about some of the aspects of the mitigation, and that's priority areas for conservation. This is a term that's getting used by the BLM, it's a term being used by us, and that is basically in the state of Oregon. Those are the core areas, but as you saw when I showed the picture of what the map shows, they're those blobs of core area conglomerations, and they've been given names and called priority areas of conservation. And then there's another area that we've been looking at, and these are areas of very rich population. So within core, not all core is all the same. Some core supports a larger number of birds than other core habitats. Some core supports a greater diversity of habitat needs and life history needs. So some of those areas that are the most riches we've identified. And then it defines what we talk about in terms of development impacts and actions. So we were trying to make it consistent with LCDC. I've been spending more time with my counterpart from LCDC in the past 3 months than I have spent with him in the past 15 years. So, but really, what we're really focusing on is large-scale development. That is the first big concern, and really focusing on commercial activities. We're not focusing on agriculture, and we're not focusing on residential development. Agriculture will be exempted based on what's in the LCDC rules, and basically residential typically is not a big issue. So what we did with...
I have a question about your map. Is it White Horse Road, the one where the big fire was down in southeast Oregon? You see you've got it as a core area, but it was burned and nothing. Is it going to come back, you hope, or?
We hope it will come back, and we think that many of those areas, you know, they haven't burned completely everything out of them. And basically, we've identified those areas have been in the past supporting and recently supporting with populations.
Right.
So we have not tried to extract that out. We're not intending to do so. You know, through time as we monitor, if we see some change, then we may have to go back and look at it. So the habitat that the modifications that we put into the rule basically has 3 new things that we're setting as goals. These aren't rules that are basically required by the department. They are basically in the rules for LCDC. One is we encourage avoiding developments in sage-grouse core and low-density habitats and other habitats that have sage-grouse. That still is good business practice. There is basically, it's embodied in the LCDC language, but for the department it's just echoing what the LCDC language establishes. And that is kind of setting an upset limit, so that basically developments in core are limited to 3%, and that's based on some scientific information back looking at some past history with sage-grouse habitat. And that development not to occur more than 1% over 10 years. What we're talking about there is very specific, and it's related to the footprints of projects. So if you're imagining, actually impacts are very, typically impacts of a big project extend beyond the project. But what this standard is really based on is the footprint of the project, what's actually on the ground. And then finally, requiring compensatory mitigation for direct and indirect impacts with the goal of a net conservation gain for sage-grouse with mitigation. So the first policy we come up with is how do we determine mitigation being required? And what we're talking to is applying the mitigation requirements to large-scale developments in core and low-density habitats, so that if a project comes forward that is identified as being in one of those areas, or any habitat type on public lands, that basically they would have to go through the mitigation process, first looking at the hierarchy, and then moving on into whatever the end product is. And then for other projects, small projects, things like that weren't encompassed like a great big wind farm, what we looked at is if it's in core and it's within 4 miles of a lake, or if it's in low density habitat within 3 miles or general habitat of a lake, what we like is to basically have the opportunity for developments going in a small development, somebody put in a small gravel pit or whatever, to be able to consult with FAWs or the local district biologist. What we really want to do in those habitats, particularly with people doing small time activity stuff, is just avoid an impact, not putting something right on top of a lake. So these aren't really intended to be big onerous things, but they're intended to do as good a job as we can of avoiding doing things that we could avoid. So the way the mitigation is built and the way it works is that there's a hierarchy. This is something that we've practiced for many years as an agency. I think we're just being a little more astute about articulating. The first step in that mitigation is avoid the impact. If there's someplace else to go do the project or some other activity, or the activity can occur in some other way, avoid it. The second one is if a project's going to go in place, then what can be done with the project and the features and the operations that can minimize its impact to sage-grouse habitat. And then finally, it gets down to compensatory mitigation. And that's what people typically think about mitigation, is going out and doing something on the habitat to improve habitat to make up for what's been lost. So, a little more specifics regarding that mitigation hierarchy. So, basically what the rules are going to come back, and the LCDC rules are going to ask that when there's a development comes across the table, across Darwin's table, that basically be working with the department in consultation to take a look at seeing if we could avoid those impacts, see if there's ways to work around. Can it be located in another area, still fulfill whatever the project developer's desires are, but move it out of core or someplace else? There is some fairly, a little more rigorous criteria though, that if somebody's going to go in core, they're going to have to demonstrate that's the only place they can do it due to technical feasibility, or that there's unique features on that landscape. So an example of unique features is a uranium mine. You just don't move your uranium mine to another county thinking you're going to get uranium. It's where it's found. So that's probably the best example I can come up with, and those are the type of issues that we'll come up with. So somebody's demonstrated there's no other place they can do this project. They demonstrated that basically there's no other engineering they can do this project. Then we look to work with them to minimize what the impact's going to be. So, and that minimization is that, you know, is there a way to change the design of the project? I did have an experience working on a proposed uranium mine, if those of you are familiar with down in Trout Creeks, where we tried to work through this, I'll be very honest, and basically it cited the mine for a certain reason, and this is where the ore was, this is where the processing plant was, and this is where the tailings are going to have to be stored. Well, we asked, can't you move the mill site off of that site because that's good sage-grouse habitat? The answer came back as no. Regulatory-wise, because the Atomic Energy Commission says it's got to be on the most stable geology in the area, it had to be on that place. So, but that would have been an attempt to minimize it by moving it off of that site or moving it out of that sage-grouse habitat. So, if we can't get through, you know, minimizing everything or avoiding everything, then it gets down to compensatory mitigation. And for compensatory mitigation, we set a standard that basically will come back and the mitigation must replace the lost functions of the habitat to support sage-grouse life history needs that were provided by the habitat that's impacted. And then work with us or with another entity. We're looking at developing, actually there's a group now working as part of the action plan on a mitigation manual, which will be looking at also an in-lieu funding program, so folks can pay for basically the level of impacts, and then that mitigation will be achieved by a third party. With that, I think it'd be a good time to answer any questions. I want to clarify something though, and please bear with us. For what we're doing, because we want to take this back to the commission. We're glad to answer, we're going to answer questions now, but we're going to ask you if you're willing or interested in providing testimony, if I could get you to step up to the table. We'll answer the questions first so you're informed, but then step up to the table, and I hope I don't scare you all, but I need to record it, so I make sure I capture the comments correctly. So, but on that note, are you going to give testimony?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay. Good night.
Sorry if it's a little awkward, I know it's a small group of us and probably easier to have a conversation, but to get the comments to the commissioners so that they hear everything that was
I wonder
said.
if you could run up the core map,
Yeah.
Sure.
please.
And then the only sort of sidebar is, we hope to limit
I know.
testimony to less than 3 minutes.
Right.
And we need you to state your name.
My name is Meredith Smith. I'm the chairman of the Lake County Planning Commission. At the north end of Summer Lake, which is on the extreme left-hand side, right, a little part, there you go. That there's two core areas there. The one that's got kind of a kidney shape at the bottom runs right through the middle of the subdivision. as planners, how are we going to mitigate that with the landowners in a subdivision where there are dozens of houses and then some empty lots? And one of those people comes and says, we want to do A, B, or C with this lot, but your map says that they're in a core area. Do we go and see FOS and
Actually, Mayor, just that map was pretty small scale.
no, I saw the big map.
And I thought we pulled the rural residential zone out of that.
No.
board.
No.
Are they still in there?
Yes. And the same thing happens with the old road from Highway 31 to Christmas Valley. There's all those acreages along there, and it just swoops right over top of them. I know it was drawn with a protractor in Salem by a consultant, but I'm telling you that at planning level, it will cause us problems, and it will cause extra work for FOS, who's going to have to say, this has been here for 100 years, and forget it. But I just wanted to bring that up.
Okay.
The other observation I had was immediately east of Summer Lake, there's about 1 million square miles of BLM land, and the military likes to go out there and drive really low and really fast and loud. They also at night go out at night and drop flares and drop special troopers and have a grand time. I understand that they probably get permission from BLM, but has anybody from the federal part of it said, oh, by the way, we have military exercises in the middle of sage-grouse habitat? And that's all I have to say
Thank
now.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. So on the first issue, I think the Chip should probably elaborate on this, but what Chip said during his presentation about we're revisiting the core area maps as part of our 5-year updates of the 2011 strategy. We'll do that in 2016, and I would think, Chip, that this is one of those areas that if it wasn't, it should have been back when in 2011 when we worked with the local implementation teams, would have been clipped out the core areas, but if we didn't get it, we go back and we visit in 2016.
And I understand your job is almost impossible because there's chunks and pieces and private land and government land running all over the place. So it's hard to be perfect, but I just wanted to draw it to your attention that you can't be hard and fast saying, well, this is where development stops.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to your credit, Darwin has been participating closely in this process the last 2 years, and he has been, is he still back there?
Yeah, I'm still back here, sorry.
Been about a poll. He's been a real champion on this particular issue, on the accuracy of the maps. And so he's continued to bring that forward. I think there's a commitment to revisit those as a part of the update of the plan.
So, and if you recall what I said, really we're targeting the big developments. So there will be in the end game some core areas that still go around, some non-habitat that's within that core.
Okay.
But that's really focusing on some of those big developments. I think we've recognized all along there are some of those smaller activities that are occurring in core that we've known all along.
That are already in place.
Yeah.
I need a clarification question. This specific example and others, if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says it's listed, they would take the information that ODFW have and say, this is what is out there. How would the state negotiate with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to adjust these core areas in this type of scenario?
There's 2 ways. One is I think it's always been a given that we would talk about through time potential adjustments to the core. We're not going to do away with them, and we're not going to carve donut holes out of it, but we've been always amenable to addressing through the local implementation teams. Are there areas that are on the edge that really don't function as part of that core? The second thing is that that was part of what we went through in the rules process by not saying that in a core area, any development had to go through this big protracted process. Instead, what we said was, if it's within 4 miles of a lake, we'd like to talk about it. But most of those small developments, because LCDC rules are gonna say your development to be a large-scale development's gotta be over 5 acres, and it has to meet these other criteria before it falls into that large scale. So what we're talking about when it's like somebody wants to build a house, we just want to be able to have FOS say, you know, if there's a way to avoid sending the dog out during the nesting season, that'd be great, or whatever, but not intending to stop the development.
Are there others who would like to come and provide some testimony for the Fish and Wildlife Commission? And you can also submit testimony in writing. Their meeting will be on Monday. It's the only agenda item. It's on Monday, the 27th. And so you can certainly submit written testimony prior to that.
Yeah, let me give you that.
Did you have, Jimmy, was your hand there?
Nope.
Oh.
And then by way of
Just wave at me.
Moving the camera.
further background, we'll be in Burns tomorrow night for a hearing such as this on the same proposed rules. And because the commission's meeting in Salem as per the schedule on Monday, we wanted to be sure we were out here in Sage-Grouse country doing these public meetings to get the input. And when I'm typing, I'm not ignoring you, Merrill, or others. The purpose is just to get verbatim the comments from we'll use the recording as well, but to get verbatim the thrust of what the comments are that we've heard here and Burns, and get those to the commissioners so that they can make an informed decision based on not just what they're reading and what Chip's saying, but based on what the public is saying too.
So the two ways you can comment to the commission, if you don't want to go to Salem, but you walk out of here and decide you want to send something, and you can get this from FOS from Mary Jo later if you want, but either written and mailed to the Fish and Wildlife, addressed to the Fish and Wildlife Commission at 4034 Fairview Industrial Drive, that's in Salem. Or you can email, which is, for those of you that actually are on fast enough internet, odfwcommission@state.or.us. I said on there to get them out by Friday, close of business by Friday, but I think Michelle Tate, the director's office manager, will be probably gathering all those bright and early on the morning of the 22nd. So if it comes to you on a Sunday night, email it.
Can I comment?
Yeah, please.
Please.
Come on up.
Mike King, I'm on the planning commission in Lake County. Craig and I have talked about this a little bit, but what I don't see in here is how the mitigation gets enforced and who does what. And does it fall back on the planning commission so say we approve something with mitigation in it and then the people don't do it? Who does what? Does Craig have to be the hammer of Lake County with Mary Jo being good ride boot or something?
I think we're anticipating a partnership, to be honest with you. What we're establishing, and the LCDC rules are establishing that for development of the mitigation, there'll be the pre-consultation process. So I've obligated our district biologists to sitting down and working up front to address the issues as best we can before. So what you're addressing has been a chronic history for quite some time, not necessarily Lake County, but we dealt with it in other counties. That's not, I don't have a perfect answer for that. So.
The one thing I would add to that is, so that the LCDC rule has a provision for tracking and monitoring development over time and a reporting mechanism that has yet to be developed. And it's my understanding that as part of implementation, the reporting mechanism is supposed to track, what kinds of impacts are occurring. But there's been a lot of thought to tracking the conservation measures as well, because we want to know how well things are working. Because if we can show an uptick in population, or we can show that areas that were disturbed aren't disturbed anymore because they've been repopulated or restored or what have you, we want to be able to track that. So that structure hasn't been developed yet. That's part of the implementation as called for in the action plan, but it's comprehensive, I think, to get at what you're talking about.
Just real briefly, looking at the graph you showed of the population, the sawtooth, it's gonna take you 30 years to show
Yep.
trend.
Yep.
It's gonna be hard. The statistics don't exist.
And for building on what, like you said, because I think it's important, is these are, the way we're presenting this and taking this to our commission is that right now, under our current rules, like Chip said, we don't have a mitigation option for proposed development in core areas. The way our mitigation rules are currently written, it is, say, ODPW's recommendation to a permitting entity like the Energy Facility Siting Council would be, don't do this, don't permit it here in core unless all the impacts can be avoided. What the legislation that Chip mentioned directed us to do and what these rules do is actually provide a mitigation option based on the fact that if there is no flexibility, it becomes a development issue, an economic development issue that often counties and county planners experience, and it's related to not just the local, but the regional and statewide economic development interests, and then local rural community health too. So this would provide an option that's not currently there under our current rules to be more flexible within core areas, but like Chip explained, it does it within the parameters of a science-based approach that we feel is adequate to be sure we're conserving the bird, and then through protections as well as mitigations, reversing trends. These are our mitigation rules, so ultimately ODPW will make will have the requirements in rule, but when it comes to actually permitting development, that would still be the role of the county if it's if it's the type of development that counties have jurisdiction over, or our other permitting entities like the Energy Facility Siting Council that gets to that level, state lands if it's something that's occurring on DSL lands. So whoever the permitting entity is that would be making the decision on a proposed development, the expectation would be that the mitigation that is required as per ODPW's rules becomes part of that decision, and then on your question, who enforces it, who makes sure when the rubber meets the road, somebody's following through on the actions. That's where Chip said we would view it as a partnership where ODPW working with county, with the development interest and LCDC involved, we'd be, needing to hold people accountable as well as demonstrate back to the public that we're having a meaningful, effective approach through mitigation, and we're not just casting about with dollars and good intentions. Some of the mitigation actions, though, and this is one thing that I don't want to talk too long here, but some of the things that could be credited in kind of the mitigation world to offset impacts are things related to invasive annual grasses, juniper and the like. So these are the kinds of things that provide habitat benefits for the bird, but also provide rangeland health benefits. So as part of this new framework, we're looking at it as there's something in it, not just for development interests who want more flexibility on proposals for development, but also rangeland, livestock, ranching interests, as well as conservation interests who all stand to benefit from rangeland health improvements.
Meredith Smith, Planning Commission again. Has any thought been given to predator control? Or is that a bad word?
Not in the mitigation rules, no.
No. But, I mean, in general, before mitigation even.
There has been some discussion. Some of the issues with regard to that is probably the one predator everybody looks at are corvids, which are the ravens and whatnot. Those would require the federal government to make that decision that there's some control. They're protected federally. Other than that, we've typically, I'd have to defer to Craig, but that's probably the most significant predatory issue that I've heard of in quite a while. So.
Great. Raven State, the increase in ravens throughout the western U.S. has been directly correlated to Sage-Grouse survival. You know, you've seen coyotes come and go, and ground squirrels are a predator, weasels are a predator. So predator control is a real slippery slope, but ravens are the one where there's some science behind it to show that actually due to man's presence on the landscape, there's been a subsequent increase in raven populations, okay? Either by providing forage base or providing nesting structure, i.e. let's quit burning and grow some timbers and then man. So, it is a little problem.
Merrill, where you'll find it is in, so in the action plan that Chip and Jamie's presentation mentioned, there's a section in there on predation. So these rules that we're having a public hearing on and that the commission's acting on are related to development, large-scale development. The action plan, though, addresses the broader issues, all of the issues affecting sage-grouse populations, including predation.
It would be nice to see some practical application of common sense between the state and the feds, as far as if they have scientific evidence and studies that are already done. You don't have to do another impact statement. Just, I mean, if they're willing to go and shoot the owls that are eating the spotted owls, maybe some ravens should check out too. Not all of them, but some of them.
I'll bring the recorder to you.
No, I just had a question. When you were talking about treating like invasive grasses or annual invasive grasses and junipers as part of like a mitigation or, in my mind, mitigation bank. So does that mean that a lot of the work we're doing through the Soil and Water District, CCAAs and such, is that going to be leverageable into a mitigation bank or for sale to a mitigation bank, I guess is the best way to put it?
So I would say, and sorry, can you do that?
Justin Farrell, the Soil and Water Conservation District.
Okay, thanks, Justin. So the short answer is yes, but it depends. So on those actions, if there's I think what it gets down to is what was the funding source that the SWCD used to do the work on the ground. And if it was, private dollars, landowners' own dollars, and potentially even state dollars, and I don't know, I can't give you an answer on how NRCS Sage-Grouse Initiative money will be counted. I think they're still thinking through that, but so long as the color of the dollars doesn't preclude those dollars from being credited, then there is an option there for that kind of a incentive to do this kind of work.
To move it into a mitigation, to put it into a mitigation bank.
There's a second component to that though also, if I could interject. And that is that the mitigation that a developer employs needs to be durable. So essentially, for that mitigation, for that property to go into a mitigation bank, there'd have to be a commitment or arrangement between the developer and the landowner that it's going to stay that way, recognizing that fire could change.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So then, my next question is, because we're dealing with LCDC in Oregon, we're talking Oregon specific or Oregon projects up within the 11 western states for mitigation if we're all under the same ESA listing. So I guess my question is, can Habitat Oregon be sold, traded, negotiated with a mining interest in Wyoming?
It's a good question.
Farmer credit. That's good.
Well, that's what it's all modeled after, it's the same.
Well, that's interesting. I don't think anybody's gotten that far. I mean, the creative idea is good thinking. To be very honest with you, the in-lieu funding program we're coming up with as a state will be the first time we've actually seriously undertaken something like that. And it partially goes back to your comment about enforcement. I think the future holds, my personal take on it is, the likelihood of development in the future isn't going to be fly-by-night stuff. It's likely going to be the large corporations coming in with wind power. It's like the Ruby Pipeline. They pay their dollars, and they're glad to pay it up front, and then that mitigation occurs. Where I've had problems with those mitigation interests are more typically with land developers around metropolitan areas, around Bend in particular.
And Justin, I can tell you, I know a lot of other states are thinking about the same thing, so is BLM. And I don't know, to be honest, where BLM's landed in their proposed RMP on whether mitigation in one state can count on a BLM district in another state where there are impacts occurring. And I know we're still wrestling with that. I mean, from a biological perspective, birds don't really know where the Nevada line is necessarily, and sometimes you may have uplift that you can gain in one spot that you might not be able to get in another. But I think part of the question is also one of if we're using state money that comes from the state legislature, are they really going to want to see it spent in another state? And I don't know, we have a clear answer on it.
I guess the main theory behind the question or thought is that Oregon with the CCAA program is, I mean, we're doing things that no other state in the affected states are doing, and we've leveraged a lot of money, and I think there's more on the way that I'm not saying I'm a proponent of it, but I think at some point if mitigation becomes that way, there's going to be eyes on the work that's being done and the quote-unquote credit that's out there that could be leveraged.
And you know, actually, I want to compliment particularly this portion of the state with regard to the work you all did associated with Sage-Grouse and to really get a lot of stuff going. You know, Plaza's have the luxury of working with a lot of cooperators.
Yeah, and the CCAs are something that Oregon's doing that has gotten national attention across the 11-state planning area. And I think for all of you who are working with and for as part of the SWCD, thanks. I mean, it's been a whole collection of SWCDs working on this across the counties, but getting the management plans in place and then actions going under the CCAAs are something that's really going to help on a variety of fronts, but including in the ESA listing determination. So it's really positive. It's one of those things that for all of us working as part of the Sage-Grouse effort, it's been a great part of the partnership where we've had folks from the ranching community, the SWCDs, bringing something forward that's this proactive.
I can carry the microphone around.
I have maybe a naive question. It's not a coyote feeding program, but can they be transferred, like groups of sage-grouse from one place to another?
Coyotes?
No, sage-grouse. Well, we know what to do with coyotes, but can they be transplanted? Because I know ODFW has all kinds of transplants.
Well, again, the guy on the ground may have another opinion. We've been working on that with sharp-tailed grouse up in the northwest with very marginal success. I think for sage-grouse, for something like that to work, and it's part of why the big focus has been habitat. All the habitat pieces need to be there. Quite honestly, if all the habitat pieces are there now, odds are the birds are there.
Yeah, that's really the bottom line. If you've got appropriate habitat, then the birds are either gonna be filling that habitat already. The only time that you might wanna look into a relocation or transplant program is if you've got, and I've actually been thinking about this for the example, is that piece up there, Picture Rock. Those birds are fairly isolated, and if they start inbreeding, we may want to just get some birds from the Warners and take them up there, because the pieces are there.
Right.
Okay, but you get through a couple of bad nesting seasons and you hit the spiral. So maybe we've got an inbreeding issue there from an isolated subpopulation. That's the only time where, unless you've built some really good habitat and you're not patient enough to wait for the birds to do it on their own, you might bring some in. But you gotta have part of the sharp-tailed problem in Northeast Oregon is we are on the marginal edge of sharp-tailed
That's right.
habitat.
Same in Washington.
Yeah.
How about the wild horses? Do they interfere with favorite bird here. I can see a big fight coming.
Yeah. Yeah, potentially on websites. But more importantly, I think it's more related to, and those of you that try and grow cattle are competing with the horses, and so are the sage-grouse for the forage resources and the condition of the range.
And your Commissioner Kestner got the opportunity to have an audience with Secretary of Interior Sally Jewell, and told her that very issue was a huge issue for his county.
Wild horses comes up in every meeting, but there hasn't been a resolution.
Right. I think that's
Not a legal
fair comment.
resolution.
So I'd say we know where conflicts and impacts on habitats are occurring, and a lot of what the state can do is dependent upon how much BLM can move under the Wild Horse and Burro Act. And I know it's also an issue that's
Just about legislated ourselves into a corner.
With the wild horses, it's, when I talked to Secretary of Interior, you know, it's a concern. They need to take care of it. I talked to the legislator, and they said they need to come together. But it's a political hot potato.
we are in that action plan, if you pick it up, Merrill, that just like there's a section on predation and what to do in addressing predation, there's also one on feral horses, and the state is pushing hard for trying to compel management within the AMLs or the management levels in those management allotments for horses. It's a big challenge for BLM, but we're looking to press on it.
I usually write at least one letter a year to the Secretary of Interior. Doesn't get touched with. Keeps it on the table.
Yes, sir.
I got a question here. On your core, and I really promised myself I wasn't going to say anything here, but
You want to.
yeah, I do. On your cores, you've got a 3.1 and a 4 miles. Is that 36 square miles and 64 square miles of a leak?
Okay, what you're addressing to is for small developments that may come in. It's not a buffer around, if you're in core and you're within 4 miles with your project of a lek, that's kind of where we'd like to visit with you. It's not preserving the 4 miles around the lek, it's just what the
But that's
criteria
any
are.
place within 64 square miles of that lek. If I'm gonna go, if I'm here and I go to here, it's 4 miles. If I'm here and I go to here, it's 4 miles.
Right.
That's a total of 8 miles. 8 times 8 is 64 square miles. That's what we're talking about.
Area coverage.
We're talking about area coverage. The second thing is, 2 other things. Some states, some parts of some states don't have a problem with wild horses in that they've been declared feral horses so they can be managed. The other thing is an apocryphal story. Sage-grouse are now, or have been, transplanted from the Sheldon to Clear Lake for the last couple of years. Okay? And now I won't say anything else.
Thank you.
Other questions or folks that would like to offer some testimony for the commission?
Well,
Brett, do you want to just say a few words about some of the outcomes of the the legislative session in terms of funding, because it directly relates to our ability to impact some of the threats
Sure.
in this area.
Sure. So, during the legislative session, my job on behalf of the department was to be in the Capitol working on the department's policy and budget issues as well as on Sage-Grouse. And this issue came up a lot. There were a couple hearings. There were a variety of bills related to Sage-Grouse, and I think all of that has to do with the fact that across the 11 states, it's a big deal. There hasn't been potential listing determination across such a huge geographic area that's come around, I'm not sure ever. So a lot of states are watching, and your representatives and senators from this area are very attentive to the issue, and so same with other places, because it affects industries and people in other parts of the state too, even though they may not understand the issues as closely or as well as you all hear. The governor's budget recommended around $4.5 million in additional funding to work on issues including wildfire risk and reducing wildfire risk. That's the operations and rangeland fire protection associations. It also included money for annual invasive grass treatments, inventory and treatments, juniper reduction, and inventory work. And then also pre and post fire resilience. So funding to deal with what to do to try to blunt some of the impacts of fire in the priority sage-grouse habitat areas, as well as where fires have burned, how to through planting seedlings or seeding, direct seeding, different approaches to get habitat back with some resources that prior to now the state hadn't been putting into those issues. So there was a $4.5 million proposal, about 3 points some million came through in the end to deal with wildfire, invasives, including annual grasses and juniper, and habitat resilience. And so that's all on the ground work that has a connection to sage-grouse, but also has the connection to rangeland health. And I think for those working with SWCD, there's a real link to making sure that money gets to the ground. This is intended as on-the-ground money for the most part. There's a staffing position tied to implementing the mitigation program, both in Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Department of Land Conservation and Development. But the bulk of the money is intended as on-the-ground money to either help leverage other sources or help meet needs that aren't being met. The Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board has committed another $10 million over 10, or at least $10 million over 10 years. So the state has been stepping up on funding, and the aim here is to show the Fish and Wildlife Service that we actually have funding resources to make the action plan real on the types of threats like wildfire and invasives that can't be easily regulated, and do that at the same time that we're providing certainty around what mitigation looks like and around the land use rules that the Land Use Conservation Department is considering. So rolling all that up into a package of giving the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service some certainty that we not only have to plan on paper, but we have something that's actually going to stand up and be implemented is important in getting to where we want to get in terms of keeping the state in the driver's seat around land use and a whole lot of other issues that could be affected by an ESA determination or listing determination. And then on the other side of it, this is not just about the Fish and Wildlife Service and sage-grouse. This is about the habitat that's also used by and important to a number of other, not just wildlife species, but livestock, economic interests that are tied to county economic development. And so we want to be standing up the plan and the approach that's going to work for rural community health and economic development in this part of the state as well. So all those resources will We'll see in the end what the determination is, but the reason for those resources is the state is betting on this being a good proactive approach that will have multiple benefits, not just for Sage-Grouse, but a whole lot of other interests too. So that's where we landed. It was a long legislative session, and it feels nice to be out here instead of in Salem. Not for the record.
It's recorded.
It's recorded.
I know. There's no way out of it.
We can make this your auxiliary office.
That's nice.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Kestner, and I know Chip and Jamie probably have some final words, but thank you to everybody who turned out as well, especially for engaging. It's an important issue, and also engaging in all that you do on the Planning Commission and the SWCD as well. It's where things get done, so thank you very much.
Just to remind everybody that different ways you can comment if you still want to comment. The other thing I would ask is if you didn't sign in, would you sign in? It just helps us out so that we can convey that, who all showed up, and we won't give your name to the commissioner unless he wants to, but it just helps us keep track of who all is there.
And I'd like to just make a comment from my perspective, Commissioner Kestner. Been around the wildlife arena of wildlife biologists for years with the Forest Service, wildlife management, dealt with Endangered Species Act, California Conger, unfortunately the spotted owl. Spent 14 years there leading up to the area and afterwards. I know the impact that enlisting can cause to community and the economy. If we come up with a good enough plan that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says, you guys got it together, the bird's not listed. That's the best option. But they expect us to stick with our plan, not to say, okay, we won, so we can't do that. The next option is the Fish and Wildlife Service said, you got a good plan out there, but there's still other threats, we're going to list it. At that point, there's two options. One is, they say, you have a good plan, we'll give you the 4D rule, and state, you manage. The other one is, state, you don't have a good enough plan, so we're not going to give you a 4D. We will manage it under the full wrath of the Endangered Species Act. That concerns me. That's my emphasis, to have at least a good plan, either for a non-listing or a 4D. The other alternative scares the shit out of me.
Yeah, and I will say, you heard this a little bit in the presentation, that, Chip and I have not had the opportunity to work in other states on this issue, but we have heard, and through Brett primarily, but through also Fish and Wildlife Service and other states, that Oregon is really being a leader in a number of fronts, not just in the local efforts for the CCAAs as a model for other states, but also in how we're working collaboratively through SageCon. No other state has a group like that that's trying to work across state, federal, local government boundaries, which can be silos and very challenging, and also to integrate the private side and the industry side and the conservation parts of that. So we're doing a number of things that are unique. And we also have a unique regulatory system already in place with our land use planning system that you all planning commissioners know well. That also sets us apart from other states. And so in a lot of ways, we're leading this effort, not because we're trying to do more, but because this is the right thing for Oregon. And because of the framework that we have, we can do some different things. And so I think everything that we're hearing is we're just doing, we've got the strongest case that we can possibly make, with no stone left unturned. And so we're in good shape, but we don't get to sit at the table and help make that decision. So we're just doing the best that we can. So you have been well represented in Lake County with Darwin, through the LCDC process. We've worked closely with the county planners to help figure out what that rule should look like, if we should have a rule at all. And he's been really instrumental and very helpful at the table, and Commissioner Kestner as well, on both of the rulemaking committees. So you've been well represented, and we appreciate that.
Yeah. We don't know what the Fish and Wildlife Service determination will be as far as whether our plan is adequate or not. We didn't want to be too restrictive,
Right.
and we didn't want to be too watery. So it's really, what we have is what we have, our best effort, and it's up to the Fish and Wildlife Service to say yea or nay.
Yep. So with that, Chip, unless you have any closing comments, I think that it sounds to me like we're done.
I want to thank everybody for coming. I know it's kind of late in the night, late in the evening, so appreciate you taking time out of your private lives.
Thank you.
And we do, and we will take these comments to the commission. We're very much obliged. Thank you. And please